Well, welcome to class 3 of our Exquisite Scrap Quilt class. I know that you've been busy drawing diagonal lines and matching up your lights and mediums, lights and darks, and mediums and dark 4-inch squares. And I've been doing the same thing. And you know what? We always learn something. You remember in the last lesson, I showed you how I had sewn two of the dark fabric to my light fabric. And I didn't realize that until I was pressing them, and then I realized there's two pieces of fabric there. Well, so I want to show you what I do to fix that. I'm just going to take my 8-inch shears, and I'm going to just slide it right along that seam allowance. Okay. And so I'm just going to leave that extra seam in there, the extra seam allowance in there. It's not going to hurt anything. It'll be just a tad bit heavier, but it's still going to be able to be usable. Well, all right, so let me show you what else I did. I almost did it again. I picked the purple and this striped fabric up to sew it together, sew on either side of the drawn line, and it felt kind of thick. Well, sometimes when you press your fabric before you cut, it will really stick together. And so that's exactly, I took it out of the machine and looked at it, and sure enough, there was an extra purple one in there. So I caught that one. I didn't have to fix it. But then, okay, the next step that we do is that we're going to cut our squares. And if you look at this one, you can see that I didn't cut very straight. And I should have been going from point to point, and you can see how I have a big long seam allowance there, a wider seam allowance. And so I'm going to recut this seam allowance, and I can use this one, but I probably will not use this one. I'll just lay that aside, and we can use that for something else. So cutting on your line helps you avoid making cuts just like that. And then I want to show you how after I've chose a number of blocks and got all 9 blocks ready to be trimmed, I sorted them into 2 piles, and like I did to begin with, I stuck a pin in them. So these are the 9 blocks that I need to make 1 square, and here's another set. And so I've got those all, and I'll keep them all in order so that we're all set to go. Well, now for today's lesson, we're going to lay the blocks out, and we're going to do some sewing. So I want to show you, see, I have a pin stuck in these too, just because it keeps them all together. And so you can see that I have 3 that are light and medium, and 3 that are light and dark, and 3 that are medium and dark. All right, to make this block, the most critical line is the diagonal. So I always take the light and dark squares, and we're going to put the dark toward me. Here, I think I have a wrong one stuck in my pile there. Light and dark, light and dark, and light and dark. Now you remember when we were sorting our fabric yesterday, I said sometime this one could read dark and sometimes it would read light. Part of that just depends on what color you put with it. And so I put a very light yellow, and so this still will read dark. Now, before you finish laying this block out, the one thing that I always do is make sure that you have high contrast here and high contrast here. And if you have one that's kind of muddied or not quite as dark, I always put that one in the center. Okay, and so that's what I would do with this one. I would leave that. Now that you have that line drawn, all you have to do is fill in the corner with your light and mediums, and fill in this corner with your medium and darks. Now, I think if you squint at that, you can see that we have a light half and we have a dark half. And so that means that we can do anything with this block that you would do with a log cabin block. We're going to take a short word from our sponsors, and when we come back, I'm going to show you how we chain piece this all together.
Havel Sewing, the choice of fabric artists for 40 years.
Okay, before I start sewing, I'm going to be using these snippets from Havel's, and I just want you to notice something on this particular pair of snippets because it's a little bit different than most of them. Most of them just had two straight blades to be able to cut your fabrics. This one has one blade that has a curl on it, and that curl can be used as a seam ripper. And ask me how I know, because I had a seam that I had to partially rip out, and it worked perfectly. It's very sharp. It also just slides right underneath those stitches. So that's just a little tip if you have this kind of a pair of snippets. Okay, so now I have my machine set up. I'm still at 2.5 stitch length. I'm using 15 weight. On this Bernina, I'm using the 97D foot. And I just want to tell you about this foot because it's a little different than most feet. 1/4 of an inch is right here on this edge. 1/8 of an inch, if you wanted to use it, is on the inside edge. And it has a wider blade over to the left. Now, partially, that is so that it works in conjunction with the feed dogs and pulls your fabric through smoothly. So it's a great foot, and I love the fact that this machine automatically lifts the presser foot up, and when you start sewing, it automatically puts it down. All right, now to sew this block, we're going to begin by putting row 2 on row 1. And you know what? This is a place where I do use pins because it's real easy to pick that up and just turn this 1/4 of a turn, and you're going to sew on the wrong edge. So I do pick it up and put a pin in the side that I need to sew. Row 2 on row 1, or column 2 on row 1. All right, now I want to sew those in that very order. So we'll get our machine going here, get my foot in the right spot. And I never sew over pins. I always take those pins out. Now I do want to just point out, because we trimmed these squares, do you see how beautifully that edge fits together? All right, and so now we're going to pick up number 2, and I usually do take that pin out right there, and now I'm ready to put it down here and start sewing. All right, and so I'm just going to use my thread saver and stitch on that. And you will believe, if you've never used a thread saver like this, you won't believe how much thread that actually saves. Compared to pulling it out and cutting it off out here, you probably save 6 inches of thread every time you cut your thread. So if you haven't gotten into a habit of using a thread saver like that, it's a really good practice to get into. Okay, so now I'm going to bring my quilt block and I'm going to lay it out again. You can see how they twist. All you have to do is pick them up and they're going to twist on you. So again, I'm going to lay row 3 over on row 2 and I'm going to pin the side I sew. And you notice I didn't cut anything apart after I finished sewing those. And now see, if you see what happens when you pick that up, it's going to turn. And so that's why that pin is so important. All right, I'll take the pin out and I'm going to align my edges. Okay, and so now we just need to make sure we don't get the first piece that we sewed on there caught in this. So I'm going to just align these edges. Well, and if you pull on it, it moves too. Okay, so now we have our square all sewn together and we have threads connecting this whole thing. What that prevents is it prevents you from turning a row around and having it going backwards or turning any one of these squares. So this is called chain piecing. It's a real time saver. So I would encourage you to try this every time you can. We're going to take just another short word from our sponsors, and when we come back, I'm going to show you how we can press this block so that we can make it fit together very easily.
I'm Amanda Murphy, and I'm a quilt and pattern designer. The Bernina Q16 is quilting magic. One of the hallmarks of a great quilting experience is when you lose yourself in your work.
Bernina, made to create.
Everything Mary strives to make people's lives brighter by designing and creating craft storage solutions. From sewing storage to general storage, we make items varying in material and uses to make your creative journey easier.
Okay, so now we're ready to press the rows so that we can have our seams nest together. So I'm just going to flip this over, and I have a wool pressing mat here, but if you were at home, you would do this off of the edge of your ironing board because it gets all of this out of the way so that you can just press the one row that's laying on top. And so again, we're just going to let the heat of the iron do the work. We're not going to scrub back and forth with our iron. We're just going to let the heat of the iron do the work for us. So now we have that row is all nicely pressed. Now I'm going to pull the next row up, and again I'm going to let the third row hang off the edge. And now I'm going to press this row in the opposite direction. And again, I'm just letting the heat of the iron do the work. Okay, so we have two done, and now we have the third row, and it's going to be pressed in the same direction as the top row. Okay, so now we've pressed this block and we're almost ready to sew it, but we're going to take a short word from our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to sew this block together and you're going to learn how to nest these seams.
Tracy's Tables has all of your custom sewing table needs. Visit tracystables.com to see the complete line of unique tables, carts, and shelves. And all of Tracy's Tables are made in the USA.
You know, it's never been proven, but we all know that the floor gets 2 inches farther away every year on your birthday? We can help you out with that. You need a design wall. Check us out at offthewallquilt.com.
Okay, so now I'm just going to take this and I'm going to lift this up so I can show you why it's important to do that. If I just take my fingers in here and the seam allowance on the bottom is going one direction and the seam allowance on the top is going the other direction, you can see how those seams nest together right there. And having the thread that's holding them makes it so it's not going to shift out of space for you there. So now I'm ready to take this to the sewing machine, and the next thing I'm going to do is align my corners, and I'll come back over here to the machine, and we're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now, I will tell you, one of the things that's a double check that I always use is I lift this up and I'm going to push the bottom forward and pull that right back in to the top seam allowance. And if you do that, you're going to find that your corners are going to match very, very well. And you didn't have to pin a thing. All right, so I've got the bottom. I'm going to push that forward just a little bit. And now I'm going to bring my other seam allowance and I'm going to pull it back until it snugs right there. And with this finger right here, I can feel that both of those seam allowances are right next to one another. All right, and so I'm just going to let my fingers be the pin and we'll sew that seam. And now I just need to align my corners and finish sewing that row. Okay, so now I'm going to clip off my other thread saver. All right, so now here's our test. Here's our test where perfect match, and we didn't have to put a single pin in it. So now we're going to flip the next row over and we're going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to, at least initially, I'm going to align that so that I can get my corners matched up. Okay, so now I'm going to stop right there so that I can lift this up. And now I'm going the opposite direction. The seam allowance underneath is going that direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tug on this top one to make sure those aligned, and now I can sew that seam. Whoa, I almost caught that. Did you see that? Real easy to catch your fabric if you're not paying attention. All right, so now again I'm going to line this up and I'm going to pull the bottom one so that it aligns. And again, I'm really using my fingers right here to test that seam allowance to make sure that they're aligned properly. Now, I will tell you, if you're more comfortable putting a pin in to sew these together, by all means do that, but you'll save yourself a lot of time if you figure out how to do this without using the pins. Okay, here's another test. Oh, this one maybe is off just a smidgen. No, I think it's okay. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do with this is we're going to, let's see, I want to press toward the dark corner. So do you remember how I had you press when you did the half squares? Where if you hold this up, the seam allowance will fall toward that side. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hold this up and press that seam. You know, before we do that, one of the things that it helps, do you see how you've got just a little bit of a wave right there? You can see it more on that yellow. if you set those seams into the fabric, it does two things. Number one, it heats up the fabric so that it will bend easier when I get ready to press from the right side. Okay, so now I'm going to set the seams in for my other seam. Set that thread right in the fabric. And you see how that smooths it out? If you have an older sewing machine and the tension isn't always exactly right for you, and you see some of that kind of gathering with the thread, that probably is a tension problem. And I would just make sure that you always set that thread into the seams, and you'll eliminate that problem, and your finished product will look a lot better. All right, so now I'm ready to press the last one, and I'm pressing it the same direction. I'm pressing it toward the dark corner. So now we can iron. Once you get that all nicely pressed and let the heat do the work for you, I'm going to just come over here and make sure I haven't accidentally messed up any of my seams on the back side. And we have one block all done. All right, I'm going to do one more of these for you, just so that you can see exactly how we laid it out and sew it together. Okay, so we're going to align. We need our 3 lights and darks, and we're going to lay those in here diagonally first. Now we're going to fill in the other corner with lights and mediums. And mediums, maybe I'll split this up, move that around. Didn't I tell you that it really doesn't make any difference what color these fabrics are? It really doesn't make any difference what colors you put together, because the whole beauty of this block is that you get a light half and you get a dark half. And look at all the different colors that are in there. Okay, now is there anything I want to move around in here at all? And you know what, maybe I wouldn't put those two together, so let's just put one of those in the corner and slip that in there. And so you see, I told you don't be matchy-matchy. That's really about the only decisions that I might make, is making sure that we have a good diagonal with the light and dark combination of the squares, and fill in this half with the light mediums and this half with the medium and darks. Okay, so I'm going to pin the side that I have to sew. Okay, so now I have this all chain pieced together. The next thing I need to do is turn it over and press it like we did for the other square. Okay, so now we're ready to sew this together just like we did before, of putting row 1 on top of row 2 and nesting those seams. And I won't do that for you on this particular square, but we've now made 2 squares. We only have 46 more to go. So our next lesson will be in playing with the layout of the blocks and sewing them together. Now before we go, I just want to remind you that the American Quilter Society has iQuilt classes that are online classes that are available 24/7 that you can take at any time, and you can watch those any place that you have an internet connection. So iquilt.com is where you'll find those classes. Also, we have these great sponsors, Bernina and Panasonic and Havel's Off the Wall Quilts and Everything Mary and Tracy's Tables have all donated some prizes that quite a few of you are going to win. You'll find that at quiltweek.com/letsquilt and just scroll down until you see the register button. Also, if you're watching us on Quilt TV, I want to make sure that you hit that subscribe button and become a regular subscriber of the videos that AQS produces. And there's thousands of videos out there of all kinds of things, from trunk shows to interviews with winners. If you're into quilts, there's a lot for you to see at Quilt TV. And if you're not a member of AQS, you can join today. Just go to AmericanQuilter.com and join the largest quilting organization in the world. So till next time, get busy sewing. You see I've got quite a bit to do too. And next time we'll be playing with the layouts of this block and have a lot of fun doing that. And then I'm going to show you the quilt that I put together. Till next time, we'll see you right here from the AQS studio in Paducah, Kentucky.